So this is going to be a somewhat unusual panel. We don't have a moderator. I'm the panelist moderator, so it's double duty. And so what I really want to try to get going in the minutes that we have is a discussion between the three of us on what does innovation mean going forward, and then hopefully drawing in some of your comments. And let me preface that with, I think that we have really old, outdated models of innovation. I think that we, all of us are and have been a part of significant knowledge enterprises. We've been a part of making innovations happen and driving them from idea into use, and the impacts, and studying these things and so forth. At my own institution, innovation is the watchword above all other words on everything that we do, the restructuring of how we're organized, what we work on, how we work on it, our new school for the future of innovation in society, the way in which we've doubled the number of engineering students that we have from 8,500 to 17,000 in the last 7 years, tripling the number of minority students, changing the retention rates, the graduation rates, the success rates, making all of those things happen. Those are all innovations, as are the algorithms, the technologies, the tools that Lockheed is building, acquiring, synthesizing, and assembling. Wayne, you've been a leader of two fantastically successful knowledge enterprises yourself, coming from a long, distinguished career. Let's talk about, is the model of innovation as we think about it from the past, how useful is it as a model?
Well, I think obviously it has to be very adaptive, because change is obviously rapid. And the word innovation today, of course, gets used by a lot of people in a lot of different ways. When I was at the Smithsonian and we were looking for a new way to brand the institution, I thought we would use the word innovation in our mission statement or values or something. And I noticed it on a bakery truck driving by, and I realized the word is used by a lot of people today, and we need to think about what it really means. And I do think it's evolved tremendously. I was fortunate working with Deborah to be involved with the first National Innovation Initiative. It was Sam Palmisano who was my co-chair at the time. And it was remarkable, because I think the distinct way the council went about it was very useful, and it was regional. It was every region had a participation in this, developing the data that fed the reports and fed the concepts. And Atlanta was one of the first stopping points, and recently you came back. I thought that was very important. But if you think about 2004 and today, what a remarkably different world you're competing in. And we at that time did not anticipate the Great Recession, nor did we anticipate that the government would go into gridlock for 8 or 10 years and create problems in terms of investments in the proper sort of way. We didn't anticipate some of the positives. For example, that our country would be energy independent, that digital learning would become such a powerful tool in higher education. So there are these things that we did not foresee. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing is, I think because the fundamentals were right, you look back and the fundamentals are the same. The way you approach them are different, but you think about the fundamentals: investment, talent, and infrastructure. Investment, talent, and infrastructure. That still applies today.
That leads to adaptation.
Yeah,
those three things.
And if you get those things right, then you've got. And I think the other thing that was really right about that initial effort was regional. If we think about the role of the federal government, we've talked a little bit about that today. It really is to set up a set of policies, laws, and investment strategies at the larger level to make make innovation possible. But innovation happens regionally. It happens in Phoenix. It happens in Atlanta. And Atlanta's firing on all cylinders right now, partly because of the original council work.
The innovation ecosystems, those are unique in these various regions.
Yeah. And so, you've got Steve Cross here and the folks, Michael Cassidy from Atlanta, and Bud Peterson, who participates in the council, president of Georgia Tech. It's amazing what's happening there, because the fundamentals, I think, are right. But what's happening in Atlanta is not the same as what's happening in Phoenix.
Right.
There are different kinds of innovation. So cumulatively, innovation comes from the regional level, but the federal government has this important role to play. And I was reminded of that reading Ron Chernow's book about Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah.
He got it. He understood the role of the federal government as well as the role of innovation. In fact, he was, of course...
He even sent the spies to England to collect the innovations that could be stolen when he was Secretary of the Treasury.
Exactly. And he was into energy innovation.
Yeah.
It was water in those days, but so you look back and there was a lot of thoughtful things going on at that time.
Yeah. So, Keoki, you're the CTO and VP of one of the most unbelievably successful amalgamations of people and ideas and technologies that humans have ever built. You know, you're in space, you're on the Earth, you're doing unbelievably complicated things. You're doing innovations, buying innovations, synthesizing innovations. How do you see the whole thing changing? I mean, how, from your vantage point, what are you seeing?
No, it's a great question, and thank you, Michael. And I'd also like to thank Deborah and, of course, Sam for this incredible gathering here. When you look at what Lockheed Martin does, and I think you nailed it, we are in the business of solving very complex problems and really taking systems approaches, whether it's in global security or in the realm of citizen services or in basic scientific advancement. And so then if you look at today's environment, I mean, some of the things that I see changing and evolving over time, one, just the simple velocity and the rate of change. And so that pace is something that we need to think about when we think about innovation. Next is the complexity and connectedness. And so that, of course, means that we are innovating not just within our walls, and maybe I'll talk about that a little bit more, but we have to be out in the world and at the frontiers, at the edges. And then the third is really what I call the nonlinearity, and that probably is driven by those other effects. And so what you're seeing now is that disruptions do not come incrementally or in an evolutionary fashion, but they truly are disruptive in nature. They're step changes. And so that has meant that we've had to take some different approaches within Lockheed Martin over the past few years. And so, for example, we are much more, you think about the Skunk Works model, everybody, and that is a brand, right? You know, everybody thinks about
SR-71
exactly.
project.
Exactly, yeah. And so these are the real cutting edge, far out stuff. And how did we do that, right? You got a bunch of really smart people who are locked up in a closed secret area. Yeah. And at least that's sort of the legend.
Warren Bennis's book on organizing genius is a fantastic study.
But the reality today is you cannot be closed up, and you're not going to have just your smart group of people knocking it out of the park there. And you have to be drawing innovation from almost anywhere. And so that means we're out. I came out of many years in Silicon Valley. We spend a lot of time looking at small and innovative companies there and seeing which technologies we can bring in. And our previous speakers, of course, talked about innovation not just in terms of technology, but in processes and business models, and those are absolutely central in terms of how we're shaping what we do. And so I think when I look at that, you have to be really always out there and pushing the boundaries, pulling in those ideas from anywhere, and that means diversity and inclusion has become increasingly important to us. So you think about diversity in an engineering company. I mean, we used to joke that diversity is like when you have an electrical engineer talking to a mechanical engineer. And the reality is...
A brown-eyed person talking to a blue-eyed person.
Exactly. And the reality is that the ideas in a place like Lockheed Martin, these complex systems solutions, are really driven at the intersections, the seams. And so now we drive very hard to have mixes. It's not just engineering, right? But we're bringing in the business, the policy, the social aspects, the economic aspects, and trying to put together teams like that. Teams, intergenerational teams, so that not only do we create learning opportunities, but we get both the wisdom and then some of the things that simply weren't taught when I was in school.
And that's why we built this new school on the future of innovation in society, is to get people that are able to communicate across all those channels exactly for those reasons.
And what we're finding is that is absolutely instrumental to the way we solve problems today, and it is a little bit of a different approach from what we've done previously.
One of the weird things, it's kind of strange almost listening to some of the rhetoric here in Washington from time to time, where you hear this dismantling and disparagement of the government in ways that are actually insulting to the core fundamental purposes that the United States was founded on. It's literally, in my view, disgusting. But it's also not reflective of understanding the history of our own country. So from the founding days of the country, Thomas Jefferson had the Corps of Discovery, which was the first government-supported, scientifically based exploration crew, which was Lewis and Clark sent out. The United States Military Academy, founded in 1804, before 1805, was founded, and it produced the nation's first significant engineers who did unbelievable things and still do. The Coastal and Geodetic Survey, the earmarked congressional project that funded Samuel Morse by direct action and direct appropriation from Congress, the gifts that started the Smithsonian from John Smithson, and it just goes on and on and on, wave after wave after wave of this country's success being in part the collective action taken by the government in areas of strategic focus, all intended to help the economy to operate in a more pure capitalistic form, but on a foundation of knowledge, on a foundation of insight and perspective. So what is it about the government that it should be doing in the realm of innovation, and why is it that so many people don't understand it? And I know you guys are heavily involved with the government, and three of us have all been heavily involved in doing government things. I mean, what's the disconnect? It used to be a thing that was clear, historical, meaningful, purposeful, and it's almost as if people are purposefully ignorant. They don't actually want to understand, and that's a hard level of ignorance to get to.
Well, well, it's a very good way to put it. I mean, I was secretary of the Smithsonian for 7 years, and it's partially federally funded and partially private funded. And to hear government workers disparaged by certain people, I think, is a mistake. The folks that work at the Smithsonian are incredibly passionate, incredibly dedicated. The institution's open every day of the year, and it charges no admission for people to come in. And the lack of understanding of that is amazing to me. And I think this nuanced world we're talking about, innovation, you need people to take time to think about how it works. Because, again, Alexander Hamilton understood it. Certainly today, as we were talking today, and you heard the panelists this morning, ever more in the future, we have to have this nuanced understanding of innovation. It's not something that happens on its own, and it is a combination of collaboration.
You mean Steve Jobs didn't wave a magic wand and Apple computers just appeared from his mind?
Yeah, no, and I heard
there might have been some flow of innovations that actually led up to that.
I heard a young person say one night at a dinner not long ago, you know, the federal government's never done anything for me, and I want them to stay out of my way. Well, that's an interesting attitude, but 90% of the patents cite university funding, which comes from typically the National Science Foundation and NIH. So there is this interface, this interaction that's critical.
Right.
And I think today collaboration is ever more important. If you talk about changes, and I look at how universities are working today, given the fact that research funding is not going up strongly, it's through collaboration with industry and finding ways to more productively collaborate with industry. Because, you know, Chuck Vest used to say, you know, learning how to deal with conflict of interest. People will say that working with industry as a university is a conflict of interest. Of course, it is. But it's a manageable conflict of interest. And it's a nuanced process.
Right.
And so today, more than ever before, we need leaders and people who use rhetoric that's appropriate to understanding this world that we're in, which is going to require special leadership to compete against the global competition we have today.
So, Keoki, you know, you guys do a lot of work with the government. You do a lot of work to solve the government's issues, which are the people's issues. People seem to forget that sometimes. It's almost like the government's like a separate thing and the people are somehow disconnected other than the ones that are elected to oversee it. And so government innovation, what's the relationship? Where should it be?
No, that's it. I think you hit a good point there. You talk about everybody's concerned about conflict of interest. I think we should be talking about our common interests. And ultimately, you know, the things that we build, we fly, you know, the great things that we do at a place like Lockheed Martin, a lot of that comes out of basic research that's done at universities. Some of that is in collaboration with us or funded by us. But the bulk of it, a whole lot of it is actually funded by the federal government. Likewise, we do a lot of work with the national laboratories. We are actually partnered with many of the laboratories. The laboratories do a lot to take those inventions and actually get them out into.
But shouldn't we just close those labs down since the Cold War is over? I heard some politicians saying that the other day. And I know there's a couple of lab directors in the room, but.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think for growth, you know, security is almost implicit and required. And so we should recognize that we are in a challenging and challenged world, and some of the imperatives of the Cold War are beginning to repeat themselves, maybe in slightly different ways.
But taking their view, so why does a fabulously successful, independently financed corporation that's seeking profits and solutions, why does it need anything from the government at all?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean,
Why can't the market just solve all these problems?
The market is good at solving certain problems, but we have to remember that, that there are some things that implicitly are what I would call of national and even international interest. The market does not necessarily pay attention to those. And if you think about it, I think back to Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln ran on a platform that was driven around internal improvements, as it was called back then. And that gets to one of the three legs that Wayne talked about, the infrastructure. And we ultimately need good infrastructure, whether it is places like the national laboratories, whether it is
underpinning of the innovation
because
ecosystem.
that enables the innovation ecosystem. And I'll give you a couple ideas. You know, you think about things like Uber, a lot, self-driving cars. What enables these? It's things like the internet. It's things like GPS. A constellation of satellites that's put up there, government-funded, by the U.S. taxpayer, generates about $90 billion of economic activity every year.
But we don't need satellites. We get the
you got it right
weather
here in
from
your
the Weather
handheld,
Channel.
Right? Exactly right. And so ultimately, we have to think, and I talk about the infrastructure behind the infrastructure. You cannot build these new capabilities that are driving such incredible innovation and change in our world today if you don't have those underpinnings.
But why is it that we're having such difficulty convincing folks that the country's success, which has been unbelievable and unparalleled in human history, is a product of taking on some of these collective things together, building these foundations, creating the environments where these local ecosystems in Atlanta or Phoenix or Maryland or wherever we happen to be can evolve, finding the best and brightest talent, a kid from Hawaii going to MIT, a kid growing up becoming the president of Georgia Tech, whatever it happens to be. How is it that and the government's probably involved in all those things from the perspective of scholarships or this support, and always has been at one level or another, either from the design of the institution. Why is this so hard? And what is it that we're not communicating that we need to communicate to get people to understand this?
Well, I think historically we'll find that this is not a new thing, but I think people have always, and that's, that's the nature of our country. We have a mistrust somewhat of our institutions, and that's not necessarily an unhealthy thing. Sure. We have a mistrust of our government. We came here, we didn't want a king. People who came here, they didn't want that kind of government. So fundamentally, it's in our genes to some extent.
But they didn't decide not to have a government. They actually decided to build one. So.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I think today it's taken a truly negative turn. I get out and about now that I'm retired and visit with folks and speak to smaller groups, and it is surprising how people just simply distrust the federal government. I love the story recently. Ken Burns did a story on the Dust Bowl, and the question was, can the Dust Bowl happen again? And they interviewed folks who went through it, and these were people who did not trust the federal government. They went there, but to a person, they all said the Dust Bowl reached the point where we had to rely on the federal government, and the federal government came through. Because the federal government understood you can't cut the roots off of these plants that stabilize the soil. And they said, if we, as farmers, started stabilizing our plants, but our neighbors didn't, nothing happened. And so the federal government has this role. It has to find its place where people want to participate. I think today, but it's a big communications problem. And I think it would be helpful if our political leaders would use different rhetoric, I think.
Yeah.
Would help build the trust that needs to be there, because there's this tremendous role for the federal government. It does not need to do everything. It does, and Hamilton understood that, for example. And I think that's a challenge. You've identified a good point.
Yeah.
Well, I think about innovation. I think about time cycles, and we are very much in a 24-hour, an instantaneous media cycle, a quarterly profit cycle, and things like that. And things that the organizations like the Council on Competitiveness can do is kind of reset and say, hey, wait a minute, there are some long cycle things, whether it's infrastructure. You can't educate a PhD in 30 days.
I have politicians say,
at least you couldn't educate me in 30 days.
We don't need any more PhDs.
Fair enough, but
this is what they say.
They can say that, but
they're crazy.
But how does that make sense? I mean, when you look at whether it's the people that are coming in from outside and building brand new companies and multi-billion-dollar institutions, how can you make a claim like that when it's just not backed up by the evidence?
Right. Evidence is an important factor. So let's talk about this. I think one of the things that's changed fundamentally in the U.S. in the last, for the U.S. in the last couple of decades is the fact that I think, excitingly, we have substantial competition from outside the U.S. And I think what better force could there be in the true American spirit of competitiveness than other nations rising and other universities being built and other corporations coming up as the whole world is evolving at a level of economic development, and poverty, particularly in China and other places, is being defeated at a scale that it's never even been possible to conceptualize in the past. And so all these things are going on as our institutions are being replicated and more competition's coming to the field and more capital is being invested. And so when you look at the United States from an innovation perspective, what is it that we're going to need to do to continue to innovate socially and culturally and organizationally and politically to be able to continue to maintain our position of outstanding excellence and outstanding economic opportunity, which then drives our social change and social success? What do we need to do now that we have real competitors? I mean, how exciting that we've got really real competitors. We're going to have a lot more. I mean, what better outcome could there be for the world than that? But what do we need to do?
Well, think of it. So I was out at the DARPA Robotics Challenge earlier this year, as I think many folks here were. That contest was won by a team from South Korea, and by the way,
where they have a college attainment rate of 68% or higher in the population.
And I got to congratulate Steve Kang and of course his team at KAIST there. But at the same time, it pulled at me because we had some very high-powered teams from across the U.S. there as well.
KAIST, by the way, at one point was a USAID-funded project to help the Korean economy to move forward after the Korean War.
So you get to one of the key points there. Where is the investment coming from? And we've made investments that have enabled others. Are we making those same investments here in the United States, whether it's in our institutions of higher learning or investing in the policies that will allow us to bring the best and brightest into the U.S. and allow them to stay here? And so that, for me, is absolutely key. The other thing, when I look, and what does this mean for innovation? It means that we, at places like Lockheed Martin and many other places, we are out there.
Global.
We are investing at places like KAIST and Seoul National. We are bringing innovations back in from these places because truly this technology, the innovations, the business models now are global. And we need to be cognizant of that, and we can't just be inwardly focused
but
within the U.S.
What are some ideas that you have about things that we should do here? So we have actually declining college going rates in significant portions of our population, where Korea has rising college going rates. They've got fantastic institutions that have been evolved. They're a close ally economically, politically, intellectually with the United States in a lot of ways. What do you recommend that we focus on?
I actually think some of the things that you're doing, places like ASU, you were just at Riverside, and we are starting to maybe reverse the tide a little bit, and and that will take time. But ultimately,
so continue to innovate, change trajectories, change outcomes.
Yeah, and it changed thinking. I mean, so Lockheed Martin actually builds stuff in the United States, and the nature of our business, we can't really export a lot of what we do. And I think
about the spy stuff.
We're talking about defense stuff, we'll call it, and I think that's important.
And spy stuff.
But look at how an airplane is built today. So today, actually, I get this email every day. What happened on today in scientific history? So Glenn L. Martin, one of the founders, or the founder of the Glenn L. Martin Aircraft Company, died 60 years ago today. He would not recognize a factory today because how you build an airplane, there are very few people around it, and you don't have an army of people putting rivets in anymore. But what we do have is an army of software engineers who are developing the mission systems that go in that aircraft. And so we are not going to, we increasingly have automated assembly lines. We don't have inspectors making sure everything's good because in a world of a digital tapestry, you're designing that quality in from the very beginning. And so, but these are the places where we are actually building that new workforce in your institutions now. And we need to continue to think of it. There are not going to be these other jobs in many of these areas. Right. And so now the good news is you have people who grew up in this digital world, and they are remarkably well adapted, certainly better than I am, to operating in it. Right. There's reason for hope.
International side?
Well, it's an interesting proposition because I remember Keoki and I were just in Beijing, and it reminded me of the times I'd been there as a university president, that you can see the Chinese capabilities improving steadily at the graduate level.
So long as it's not across the street on a polluted day.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. They've got their problem. I also participated in, thanks to the council, in a G8 summit run-up in Moscow at one time. And it was about innovation. And you had all these countries there talking about it. And it struck me, everybody has this exact same aspiration. Everybody kind of knows the fundamental, but the circumstances are different. Some countries have corruption problems. Some countries have maybe too much direction from the central government. Maybe China, that's a problem. Those kind of issues. And each country will figure out how to do it. But clearly, we're in a much more competitive environment today. When, again, you visit China, and I was in Duzhongwei on other business, the infrastructure investments in China are amazing. And we see, I'm all for this new highway bill that just passed. 5 years of stability is helpful, but it was at about 60% of the level at which should have been to really address problems so we don't have more problems with infrastructure developing than we're repairing. And we aren't at that level. We aren't at the right level of investment in R&D. And so I think we have to really keep our eyes finely tuned. We have advantages. We have, I think, a culture. We have the best higher education system in the country. You know well, Chinese students are in all of our institutions because we have great higher education. We have to keep these things sharp as a tack, because that's the only thing that's going to allow us to outcompete the others. Because I remember.
Yeah, 48 of the states have been disinvesting in public higher education.
Well, exactly. You've seen all of that. I remember the statistic not long ago was that China graduates more English-speaking engineers of the highest caliber than we do. That's an amazing statistic. And if we have to watch our P's and Q's. There are things we're not investing in, and we can lose that battle. But we still have an advantage if we maintain our attention and our focus on what are our advantages, what are the things we can do well, and we can't back away into, as you pointed out, away from China, away from the international scene. We got to get out there and compete. Mm-hmm. That's going to be the way it's going to win.
And cooperate and draw in talent and connect and link and do all those things, which requires very sophisticated mindsets. So let's just, we've got 4 minutes and 16 seconds left, according to that highly evolved flat panel screen that came from somewhere in Asia. Comments, questions from anybody? Anybody want to jump in here and see what, how you can, yes, Luis?
Michael, you've addressed a number of issues that are very relevant, and in the spirit of the program that we're looking at working with NCF in the year to come, two areas might be well worthwhile to explore from a policy perspective. The first is the relationship between the federal government and the regions that we examined in the original innovation report. And the Celeste Thornburg report comes to mind, where it called attention to the fact that there is not a good relationship between the federal government and the needs and opportunities and potential of the regions and the states. The second is the kind of purposeful ignorance that you talked about, where our politicians would think that the jobs that are being eliminated today can simply be protected and brought back. And in the process, we are deluding ourselves, and most importantly, those who've lost the job, from taking on the new training that will be required to take on the jobs of the future, which, by the way, will not necessarily be in the areas that the jobs were lost in. So I wonder what your collective thoughts would be in those two areas as we approach this innovation.
Well, one thing that I would add is I think that there's some wisdom in a number of our governors right now. Governor Haslam in Tennessee, Governor Abbott in Texas, Governor Hickenlooper in Colorado, and a few others who have set post-secondary educational attainment goals above 60%. This is for post-secondary outcomes where some kind of certificate, technical certificate in coding or some other area of technical work, an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree. Now, there's a lot of people that resist against this because we're at this moment where we never had to do anything like that before. People forgot that in 1900, only 8% of the U.S. population had a high school diploma in 1900. That world is gone. No one can even remember it now. And in the 70 years after 1900, we changed everything. Well, we need to change everything again, and there are some governors out there that are taking a lead. So I think one of the most important things is to set objectives that we can get everybody behind and begin working toward.
Well, I'd just like to address what you said about sort of this passivity about letting certain kinds of jobs escape. Escape is probably the wrong word. But we think about that very hard in Lockheed Martin, because once you stop building something, you don't have the infrastructure and really the talent to be able to get that back. And I think that same applies. And so we're very thoughtful about what do we need to make in-house versus what can we let outside. I think the same needs to be true when you think about the United States, because you can't simply recreate from scratch in any reasonable amount of time. I was talking with Wayne earlier about the example in Easter Island. Why did they cut down the last tree on Easter Island? What were they thinking? And the reality was that at that point in time, everything was so far gone that it wasn't an economically important thing. Where is that cliff for us in terms of letting economically important things go?
Yeah, they probably didn't believe in
economy?
climate change either.
Yeah, that's a possibility as well.
So, Wayne, final word?
Just from a point of view of an educator, I think I've really felt throughout my life as an educator, I was trying to help students prepare for life, not for a job. And when you think about that and you think about the educational process you go through, you're trying to help a student be flexible. You're trying to help a young person have the capability to change. The statistics that I hear are stunning to me as an old timer, is that the average young person will change their jobs 8 times by the time they're 40. That was unheard of in my era. And that means they're changing jobs, as Luis was saying, that might be in a completely different area.
They even say now it may be careers.
Yeah.
With job changes even more than that. They might change their careers
Their
3
entire
or 4
careers.
times.
And so you have, and I think there are 2 parts to that. One, we're seeing more and more that universities have a role and a place to play in long-term learning, because people need to come back.
Lifetime learning.
Yeah, lifetime learning. Georgia Tech has this wonderful new digital degree program that in computer science. You can get
I get a message from Zvi Galil every day on
Exactly. Yeah, but what's interesting is quite a few people who have enrolled to get this degree already have master's degrees, already have PhDs, but they said everything I learned is obsolete.
Renewal, right.
And you got to come back. And so this is the way of the world today. And people have to live with it. We have to help them in education.
Michael, I'll just say, that renewal is enabled by, I think, core principles in the United States. And we worry about level playing fields, but ultimately we need to come back to those core principles. A capitalist system, openness, transparency, ethics, integrity. Ultimately, those are enablers for innovation.
And I would just add one thing to that, and that is the complete and total obsessive focus on our human capital and their success. And then in what Wayne just said, doing every innovation that we possibly can so that a person can continue to learn easily, quickly, and become more adaptive through lifelong learning so that they can adjust to whatever lies ahead. So with that, Deborah, that's our panel.